Thanks, guys. I'm going to try to figure out the best way to stand. Can you guys see over here? Like, see the slides if I stand, like, around here? Okay, cool. I don't know any magic, by the way, so. And actually, I don't even have the word magic in my talk, so maybe I should throw it in there like the Apple thing, you know. So I'm Jason VanLue, like Rob said. I'm at Jason VanLue on the Twitters if you want to sling some things at me. And today we're going to be talking about three-pipe problems. Three-pipe problems. So let's get into it. As a rule, said Holmes, the most bizarre thing is the less mysterious it proves to be. What are you going to do then, I asked. To smoke, he answered. It is quite a three-pipe problem, and I beg that you won't speak to me for 50 minutes. So we have a lot of three-pipe problems in the world today, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in the few minutes that we have. We're not going to smoke or anything, but we're going to talk about some of those things. So one of the things that I like to do, if I don't want to give a really detailed description of what it is that I do, because that tends to change on a daily basis, is sometimes I'll just say, well, I'm a designer. And usually you get the response, okay, well, what do you design? And just out of curiosity, how many of you would be designers in here? You design stuff. Any developers? Web developers? I know the Envy crowd is a developer. Got some more over here. How about like just creative services, marketing, all of those kind of things? Okay, cool. So when we talk about design, and really when I talk about design, I'm also including development in that. When we talk about building things specifically for the web, specifically for the digital world, we design and we build a lot of things, right? It's kind of tricky when we try to define what design actually is. I mean, we design graphics, we design layouts, sites, apps, experiences. There's a lot of things that we design. But what is it fundamentally that we do? Are we just service providers? Are we just sort of blue-collar workers that get things done? Or is there something a little bit more core to what we do? And I think that there is. I think that as designers, as developers, as creatives, we are problem solvers. And that's really what it comes down to. We solve problems. You probably have seen this quote, that the only intuitive interface is the nipple. Everything after that is learned. And if you think about it, everything after that is learned. Everything after that is designed. So we're going to go back to 1916, and we're going to talk about a guy named William J. Newton. And he's an aspiring engineer up in the Northeast, and he's trying to figure out how to make lighting rooms a little bit easier. Right, the light switch, the electric switch has already been created. Not the light switch. The electric switch has already been created. But he's got this problem of trying to figure out a way to conveniently light large spaces and be able to manage that effectively. So he submits this patent to the federal government. You probably recognize this. This becomes probably one of the simplest and most recognizable interfaces in the world, the light switch. So I want to do a little hands-on thing. Hopefully you guys have had enough coffee. So I want you all to close your eyes. It's not going to get weird, I promise. All right, close your eyes. I want you to pretend like you're flipping a light switch from the off to the on position. Okay, you stick out your hand, pretend that you're flipping off to on. Okay, pretty easy, right? Okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to pretend like you're driving a car, okay? And I want you to put your hands on the steering wheel like your dad taught you when you were 16, not like Denzel Washington in Training Day, okay? Not, you know. All right, so 10 and 2. And then I want you to pretend like you're switching lanes from the left lane to the right lane. Okay, left lane to the right lane. You guys are terrible drivers. Seriously. All right, so you probably took your hands, moved them from the left, 45-degree angle to the right, back to center. Does that sound about right? Well, you just ran 10 people off the road. It's actually not right. The correct motion is in the center, 45 degrees to the right, and then an equal distant 45-degree angle to the left to correct your heading back to center. So you probably kind of feel, I don't know if you guys can see that, a little bit like Luke when he's wearing the blaster shield and he's getting hit with all this stuff, right? If your eyes are closed, you can't really figure out what's going on. But the point is that design solves problems. As designers, as developers, we solve problems fundamentally. Now, for the deaf people, their communication is a lot different than you and I have communication, in the sense that they have to maintain eye contact at all times when they're talking to somebody. And so, literally, when you watch two deaf people talking, they almost lock into kind of a dance, going back and forth with one another. And if they're walking down the road or doing some other action, it's very interesting to watch how they interact with each other and maintain that eye contact. But the problem with this is standard architectural spaces typically aren't optimized for deaf people. Right? This is a beautiful space in here. But chances are it's probably not all that optimized for those who are hard of hearing. So this is a problem, right? Spaces aren't optimized for those who are deaf. Well, the folks at Gallaudet University are trying to fix this, and they're creating something called Deaf Space. You might have heard of this. But essentially what they're doing is they're trying to reinvent how spaces are designed to be optimized for those who are hard of hearing. And here are some of the things that they're doing. They're creating things to where sight lines are easy. Remember I talked about you have to maintain that sight connection when you are trying to communicate with a deaf person. So they're trying to cut out walls and things that would block that sight line. Secondly, they're painting walls certain colors like blue because they've shown that the blue color actually makes it easier to communicate. And there's things that it does emotionally that helps that communication process. And they're creating these whole spaces, and they're creating these designs. They're designing these whole spaces to be optimized for deaf people. One of the things that they're doing is they're rounding walls. So instead of having right angle walls where obviously you and I don't have a problem because we can hear what's coming from the other side, deaf people can't. So by rounding the walls, not only is it easier to walk around and see, but the sound also reverberates better so they can feel the vibrations if somebody's coming around. That's a problem that is being solved through design and through creative thinking. So in essence, design is about asking why and why not. These should be the two questions that we ask ourselves as designers and developers on a daily basis. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? Or why aren't we doing these things? And we're kind of at an interesting place in our industry, aren't we? I mean, when we talk about design, specifically as it relates to web startups and those kinds of things, design is really being talked about quite a lot. There's starting to be a real value put onto having design in your organization and in your company. But there's also been those who kind of disagree with that. You might have seen this article. This was posted several months ago, in which the author is essentially saying that design doesn't matter. Right? Here's another one. That designers are not a panacea. And some of the points that he makes, or that both of the authors make, are actually valid. I think he raises a lot of good points. But I think there's a fundamental problem here when we try to think about, okay, what sort of value does design have? And as a designer or as a developer or as a creative, what sort of value do I have in the industry, and what am I actually doing? And I actually believe that design can change the world. And it sounds cliched, I know. But I want to talk a little bit about how I think that can happen. The world that we live in is broken in a lot of ways, right? We have a lot of problems that really we need to solve. Take the car, for example. When Henry Ford created the car, he solved a problem of human transportation. Now, it wasn't like as humans we weren't able to transport ourselves from one space to another. I mean, we rode in these fancy chariots a long time ago. We rode on horseback. We even had our own 2 feet to be able to get us from one place to another. Henry Ford didn't necessarily solve the problem of human transportation. He made human transportation better. And so in a lot of ways, when we're talking about solving problems, we don't always have to solve the whole problem. We can just make something better. We can make something more optimal. We can solve smaller problems. And Wilson Miner, in his talk, When We Build, that he gave, I believe it was last year, he talks about the car really being this fundamental tectonic shift that happened in our lives in the 20th century. I mean, think about it. After the invention of the car, Think about all the things that we built, all of the environments that we built around the car, around that one tool. We built highways, we built roads, we built suburbs, infrastructure, all of these things built around that one tool that we have, the car. We want to fix the world, and so we design. Even non-designers want to fix the world that they live in, and so we can come up with ways in which to do that. And that means that we'll keep designing. That's a good thing as designers, right? We'll always have work to do because there will be problems that will need solving in the future. Wilson Miner continues his thought in saying that the screen in the 21st century is what the car was in the 20th century, in the sense that it's that one tool, it's that one element that we're going to build environments around. And if you think about it, we're already seeing how that can happen, right? I mean, on the subway, look at the variety of devices and that funny thing down at the end with pages and ink and covers. And actually yesterday, I heard my wife telling my 6-year-old son, it was about, I don't know, probably lunchtime, I guess, and she kept having to tell him, get off the screen. And those were the words that she was using. You've had too much time on the screens today playing whatever, Wii, DS, those kind of things. I mean, we even play Pictionary on our screens now. I mean, what happened to the big, pad thing that you set up with the colored markers and draw stuff on? Now we can play Pictionary on our phones or on our iPads. But the point is that the screen is really becoming something that's so ingrained in our lives that we're building environments around it. We're building this infrastructure around this one little tool, the screen. But the cool thing is it's up to us what we build, right? Because everything on that screen has to be designed. A screen is just a screen without something that's designed for it to actually use it. So that's cool for us that work as designers or developers in the digital world working for the web, because we get to determine what goes on these screens. We get to build those environments. It's almost like you were back in the 1920s or 1930s when the car was just starting to sort of catch on in our lives, and thinking about how cool that would be to sort of have this wide expanse of nothing in front of you to be able to create for. And I want to take a little side note here, talking to both the designers and the developers in the room, because I think we have a tendency, specifically as designers, to sort of have this dividing line between the two, right? We design, and these guys over here develop, and they don't touch our stuff, and we don't touch their stuff. But Cameron Coxon has a really good quote about this, and he says that if we want design to be seen as more than decoration, we must treat development as more than plumbing. And I think that's a really interesting concept, because when you're building a house, obviously everything has to be integrated together. The plumbing has to work. The structural integrity of the house has to work. It has to look good too. But they all have to work together. They're not mutually exclusive from one another. And I think the same thing is true of designers and developers. Developers design almost as much as designers do, right? As you engineer something, as you're building a product, they're designing. We're building as we design, right? Because if we're not building anything as we're designing something, then really we would just be artists. And I love art. But when we talk about designing for products and building things and solving problems, there's a lot of structure and a lot of building that goes into that. So we need to sort of have this dividing line be removed between designers and developers and work together with one another and understand and realize that what we both do is valuable, what we both do is essential to creating awesome products. So at this point, you're saying, okay, well, that all sounds great, solve problems, yeah, change the world, great. But I'm just a web designer, I'm just a graphic designer, I'm just a developer, whatever. What problems am I really solving? Am I really making a difference here? Does it matter? Well, I think it does matter, because keep in mind that the problems that you are trying to solve on a daily basis, they don't have to be huge. You don't have to be William Newton or Henry Ford creating the new car. They don't have to be comprehensive, complicated problems. They just have to be human problems. Because we design for people, right? We don't design for this ethereal world that nobody ever touches. We're designing for real people. Dieter Rams says that you cannot understand good design if you don't understand people. Design is made for people. we need to design for the other side of the screen. As we work to design all of these interfaces and products and digital elements for these screens, we need to realize that at the other side is a real person with a real life, with real struggles, with real problems that we need to solve for. And it's kind of hard to remember that at times. We can get so caught up in what we're designing in Photoshop or what we're coding or what we're developing and forget that there's real people behind the things that we're building. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be for people. And I think this is where those articles that I mentioned before really get it wrong, because if your product reaches people, you need design, period. You need design because we're designing for those people. Dieter Rams also says that the times of thoughtless design, which can only flourish in times of thoughtless production for thoughtless consumption, are over. We cannot afford any more thoughtlessness. And that's so true now, just as it was 40 years ago. Wilson Miner says that the things you and I make might not make a visible footprint on the earth. But what do we want to spend more time with? What do we want to shape us? What do we want to see grow? And I would add to that, what problems do we want to solve? Right? We don't have to get caught up in the fact that we might not, quote unquote, change the world as everybody sees it. But there are small things, small problems that we can provide solutions to. What problems do you want to solve? What are those things that you want to work on to make a difference in the world around you? This is Louis Pasteur. He was a French scientist. And what's interesting about the way that he worked and the time frame around that he worked, and as you kind of think of, okay, as a designer, as a developer, the things that I'm working on, do they really matter? Is it really worth the effort that I'm putting into it? Well, while others blew stuff up in their labs having a lot of fun, Louis Pasteur was making milk safe. And the point there is that he's trying to make a difference. He's focusing on solving a real problem, while a lot of others are just having fun playing around with things. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying the work that we do, with playing around, with being creative, but at the same time, we need to remember that there's real people with real problems that we can provide solutions to. So we need to make sure that we are keeping that in our minds with everything that we're working on. So as an example, one of the problems that I see, specifically as it relates to design, and I think this is something that developers do a really good job about, is open source projects. Okay, so developers have a lot of open source projects that they build, that they contribute to of their own free time. Rails is an example. The Rails framework that's built on the Ruby language that powers a lot of the web nowadays. Twitter is built on Rails. That's all open source. Somebody developed it, put it out there for everybody to use. As designers, we really don't have those things, do we? We're not really necessarily contributing to open source projects from a design side. And I think that's a shame, because I think a lot of designers have a lot to offer the community as a whole. Now, this doesn't mean that we go and do spec work, right? Totally against spec work. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of benefit to the community as a whole that we can be contributing to. I think it was Andy Clark recently also who open sourced one of his client projects and basically said, here's what we did for the client, here's my whole repo, here's my whole design, take and learn from it. The other thing is education. This is something that we're working on specifically in the lab with Code School, in that we feel that the education system is broken. And in particular, as it relates to technical education, teaching people how to code, teaching people how to design. And so this is something that we're trying to work through practically with what we built on Code School. So where do we go from here? We talked about solving problems. We talked about how design and development actually matter. And I think that if design solves problems, if we can agree on that, then we can also agree that creativity is what fuels design. This is CreativeMornings, talking about creativity. Design solves problems and creativity fuels design. So how do we become creative? How do we get creative? Well, this is John Cleese, you might know him from Monty Python fame, British actor. He gave a talk in 1991 on creativity. So I want to spend the last few minutes here just sort of bringing up a couple of points that he has. He talks about there being two sort of mental states that we get into. The first is the closed mode, and this is essentially our get things done mode. This is our analytical, mental state that we get into when we want to get things done. then we also have the open mode, which is essentially our free thinking mode. This is where ideas come. This is where we can play with ideas. This is essentially where solutions are found. This is Alexander Fleming. And back in the early 1900s, Alexander Fleming was doing an experiment in which he laid out several petri dishes and tried to grow bacterial cultures in each of those petri dishes. And he noticed that one wasn't working. There were some weird things going on with that one. Now, if he was in the closed mode, what do you think would have happened? Probably would have chalked that up to just an anomaly, whatever, throw it in the trash, not a big deal, focus on the other petri dishes. But instead, he was in this open state of mind and was able to think creatively about it and started asking questions, started asking why and why not about what was happening in that particular dish. And the result was the discovery of penicillin, the first antibiotic. Alfred Hitchcock, in meetings that he would have with his movie production team, so when they were coming up with scripts and trying to figure out how to do a particular piece in one of his movies, they would be arguing back and forth, and one person would have one idea, one person would have another, and they would have this problem that they're trying to solve. And all of a sudden, Hitchcock would stand up and he would tell this random story. It had nothing to do with what they were talking about. It was completely random, completely off the cuff. And everybody in there would just sort of look at him like he was crazy. And be like, why is he telling us this random story? And he would say to them, look, the ideas will come. We're trying too hard. We're pushing too hard. The ideas will come. Let's just loosen up. Let's tell stories. And those ideas will begin to generate. We must allow ourselves to think in the open mode and then execute in the closed mode. So as we're trying to be creative, as we're trying to come up with solutions for these problems that we have around us, we need to be thinking in that open, creative, free thinking mode. And then once we found that solution, we can jump into the closed mode and begin to execute analytically on those things. Cleese says that creativity isn't a talent, it's a way of operating. It's a frame of mind. I think this is so true because as designers and probably even as developers, we can at times feel that we're not creative enough. We don't have the creative spark. We don't have the same level of creativity as that other person. And I think this goes to the heart of that in saying that it isn't an innate talent necessarily, it's just a way of operating. It's a way of framing your mind so that you can think creatively so that you can solve the problem that you're trying to solve. So he gives 5 specific ideas for how to build creativity. And the first is give yourself space. He says you need to have a space that you can go to that's not full of distractions. It's a place where you can think openly, clearly, and let your mind begin to develop those solutions to the problems that you're trying to solve. The second is to give yourself time. We've probably all been here, right? So you sit down in this awesome space that you've created for yourself. You're like, okay, I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to be creative. 90 seconds later, oh man, yeah, that email from Tim I got to respond to, and oh yeah, that project is due soon, and wow, my keyboard is really dirty, and yeah, it's about time for coffee, and oh, my wife's calling me, and oh, and all these things start to come into your mind, right? We've all been there. And so what inevitably happens is you focus on one of those things, and 90 seconds has gone by, and that's the extent of your creativity time for the day. And what he says, he says, that's fine, everybody experiences that. Don't try to fight that. Just let it go. Let those thoughts go. And he said within 2 or 3 minutes, your brain will finally calm down. You'll be able to then go back and start to think in this open mode again. So don't be so quick to jump on those things that you feel like you have to do. He talks about giving yourself a time-space oasis. So building that space you can go to for a period of time where you can think openly and think creatively. And this isn't a typo. The third thing he says is you need to give yourself time again. And I thought this was interesting because he says that the reason that he was the most proficient in creating the best Monty Python sketches is not because he was more creative than any of the other people on the team. It wasn't because he had anything special. He says it was because he gave himself more time to come up with better solutions. So what he would say is that if it wasn't due until Wednesday, he wouldn't submit anything until Wednesday. He would allow himself to use that extra time to think of better solutions. He says that what tends to happen is when we're trying to think creatively and we're trying to solve these problems, if we come up with a solution, that sort of relieves that anxiety that we have about not having a solution. Right? We've all been there. If we're working on a design, we can't come up with something. There's that anxiety there. There's a deadline we have to meet. We have to get this stuff done. And so there's that anxiety that builds up trying to find a solution. And so what he says is that when we find a solution, that relieves that anxiety. And the problem is that the good can become the enemy of the great. If we go with that first solution, even if we have a lot of extra time that we could use to come up with a better solution, sometimes we don't come up with the best thing we could. So give yourself time. If something's not due until Wednesday, allow yourself until Wednesday to present that end result, even if you use the first thing you came up with. And then he talks about having confidence. And this relates to the environment in which you are trying to be creative in. He says a lot of times what can happen is if you're in an environment that is overly negative in the sense that when you talk about ideas, they get shot down or you get laughed at when you bring up a crazy idea. Those kind of environments stifle creativity because it stifles your confidence in the ideas that you're coming up with. Instead, if you have an environment where no idea is off limits, where you can bring up anything and you may get laughed at, but it's not going to actually mean anything to get laughed at. You guys laugh at me all the time. That's an area that can build your confidence and you'll get better at generating those ideas. So if you work on a team or if you manage a team, make sure that that environment is one that doesn't stifle that confidence and that creativity, but one that actually promotes it and allows those ideas to flow. And then finally, he talks about humor. And he says that humor is the gateway to creativity. Now, this is coming from Cleese, Monty Python, obviously, so I'm going to think humor is valuable. But I think it's interesting here because he talks about there being this idea, especially with clients, corporate clients, of it being a very serious project. This is a corporate project. We can't laugh at this project. We have to be really serious, and it has to be, we have to use words like synergy. We have to use words like hot, and those kind of things. And he says that, why the hell would we be so serious when we're trying to be creative? What's the point? There's no point to being serious when you're trying to be creative. Laugh. Allow yourself to be laughed at. Bring humor into the mix, even if it's a quote-unquote serious project. Because it allows your brain to loosen up and think through those things. And for Hitchcock, he would tell a crazy, random, funny story. If for nothing else, then just allow those ideas to flow. So design solves problems. As designers, as developers, our job, our role, is to provide solutions to these problems. So when we talk about how design can change the world, I think this is how. Beth Clark says that people who really want to make a difference in the world aren't determined to revolutionize the world all at once. They're satisfied with small changes. She goes on to say that they don't do anything to call attention to themselves. They simply pay attention to the everyday needs of others. So as we think about how we can change the world with what we do as designers, as developers, as creative thinkers, focus on the small changes that we can make. Focus on the needs of others. Pay attention to yourself. Pay attention to what others need. Make things that they will love, that they will enjoy. And you will begin to start solving those problems. So the challenge today is that as creatives, we need to solve real problems in our work. We need to design real solutions. Thanks.
One of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning is that part of the Creative Mornings process is that after every talk, we'll just open up for Q&A. Anyone and everyone to ask Jason some specific questions about the content of the talk. So we'll do that now.
Questions? Comments? Crazy ideas?
I'm thinking back to the beginning of the talk. You mentioned the automobile, kind of elaborating on that. That was a really good analogy, kind of the screen thing. I love my car, I love mobility. Of course, everyone knows like automobiles present big problems in terms of just human connectivity, community, and all that stuff. So how do we deal with, and we see this same kind of thing in the screen at times too, there's a disconnection that's taking place, human-wise, you know, peer-to-peer. So how do we avoid, or how do we deal with unintended consequences of design? What things can we build into the way we design that helps us address negatives that come with good stuff?
Right. You get hired for every job if you can solve that problem. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that we need to realize I don't think we'll ever arrive, right? I don't think we'll ever get to that place where our design is perfect. But I think that's okay because I think people understand that. I think people get the fact that things have to change and they have to grow, and that, especially with new things. Right? I mean, you look back at the cars in the 1920s and how much they broke down, and they went like 15 miles an hour. You could almost walk faster than the people in the cars. And so, I mean, you kind of translate that now to the screen, and you look at the different devices that we have, and obviously with things like responsive design, figuring out now that we should actually pay attention to how our design looks on a variety of devices, not just how it looks perfectly in Photoshop. I think getting out of that mentality that, you know, really going back to that idea that we are designing for people, and so the sense that we shouldn't have constraints that are based on our personal preferences or personal ideas. We need to be thinking more like that last quote about others, the needs of others, what they're wanting, how they use things, rather than how we want to project that on. I don't know if that was a big cop-out question.
No, that's fine. I think one of the differences too is the malleability of the screen is much more, like, you can do that much more quickly than an automobile, which is a physical, you know, object that produces real physical problems. So I appreciate that. I think I asked myself that question.
Yeah, and I mean that's a good point too. You know, that's one of the things that I got from Wilson Miner's talk. If you haven't had a chance to see that, just Google Wilson Miner Build Conference or Wilson Miner When We Build, and he just a really inspirational talk about how cool it is that we get to design things for this screen, and that essentially we can create whatever we want to create. And just how cool that is that people actually are going to be using it. It's going to be mattering and making a difference in people's lives.
I didn't fully hear his question, so I may be asking the same thing. But you talked about how designers are, the goal is to solve the problems of people, and therefore we need to get to know people. Can you speak to or comment on like how the screen is now changing? People aren't the same as they were on the screen, and as you one picture showed on the bus, people aren't relating to people as much anymore, even though there's still people with real problems in everyday life. They're changing very much as a result of the screen.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, obviously we're designing for people, and that the screen sort of, I guess, comes in between people, right? It's changing the way that we interact with people. So there's almost a catch-22 there, right? We're designing for something that's driving a wedge between people. And yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I think that's something that we're going to have to, even as a culture, as a world, we're going to have to deal with. As more and more screens become part of our lives, figuring out that there's still people that live on the earth we need to interact with, not just screens. But at the same time, I think you can look at it another way and say that look at how screens have revolutionized how we interact with people. So now, you know, even going back to the simple things like email, now you don't have to send letters to people anymore. And as romantic as that would be, it's nice to be able to shoot an email to somebody, or I can chat with another designer over Twitter, you know, in Europe. We can have a relationship and build a relationship. I mean, I think those are the kind of things that I've been able to build relationships with so many people that I would never have come to know outside of the internet and those screens. So I think our job as designers is, in part, to create those products and interfaces and designs that bring people more together as opposed to trying to drive a wedge between.
I'm just sort of wondering, I was thinking about what you were saying about we build environments around the things that we build, and I wonder what it looks like, or what you think about the idea of like the reaction of that versus like where that starts. Maybe it's a chicken and egg question, like do we start with, kind of creating an environment around something that we build, or do we start with the environment that we want to live in and be a part of and build there and have the confidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is, do we start with the environment that we want, or do we build something so that environments can be built around it? Right? Yeah, that's a great question. I personally can't build an iPhone, so I'm sort of left with having to build things that can kind of. So I guess I would be more in the camp of building environments around those kind of things, because I don't really have a say over what those devices are. But I think we can probably do both, because the things that we build shape how devices in particular that have those screens on them are built, in the future. Obviously, if a device is created and we find that it's not being used for specific reasons, and we design to fix those problems, and it creates a totally new element, and I think that's a good thing. And so I think that's another sort of inspiring piece of being a designer, being a developer, building these kind of things. You get to sort of determine what that looks like. I mean, we do, in a sense, get to determine what the future is going to look like based on the things that we design. So I think that's kind of cool. We get the opportunity to do that. So, if that answers your question.
I just think it's one of those philosophical things that it's
Yeah, it
kind of
is. Yeah.
because we're, like you started saying, we live in a fallen world, like there are a lot of broken things. So when we think about what we would want that to look like, that it would be transformed, or that it would change, I don't think it's necessarily just about fixing things.
Right.
But I think it's actually about creating and kind of stepping into moments where something new occurs. And so where that begins with design, I think there are things that we're going to have to react to.
Right, exactly.
In a sense, but I hope that our reaction is more response as opposed to reaction. What I
Yeah.
think. But I maybe in my ideas, I love the idea of like starting to think, this is what I want to be a part of, so I'll create it.
Right. And the other thing too, I think, is that we design a lot for the digital world, right? We design a lot for screens. I design primarily for screens. But I think I have a lot of respect for people who do that, but then also can create real products too. I mean, not like the screen. The screen is a real product that you're creating for, but like something tangible that you can hold. It's like an actual, industrial design product. And so I don't think we can be, we need to limit ourselves in what we're designing either. And going back to sort of Lisa's points about if you're allowing yourself to operate in that open mode and think through those ideas, you may come up with a solution that doesn't have anything to do with screens. You could design a new system of doing things. One of the things that we're working on in India right now that these guys have sort of come up with is something that we're applying to the screen, so sort of a learning model, a way of learning as it relates to kind of code school and teaching code and development. But we're applying sort of the idea that's been designed to the screen. It doesn't necessarily have to be just on the screen. So those are the kind of things that I think we can allow ourselves to think more broadly than just the screen. I think that'd be helpful in what we create.
You talked about like open source. You're doing to see that happen in your own life.
Yeah. Well, Nick right here is working on Haml. Can you be familiar with Haml? It's like an HTML abstract, sort of like markup. Basically, it's easier to write HTML. And it's an open source project, and so he's working on redesigning the branding, the site, a lot of the pieces that are included with the whole Haml interface to allow people to have more access to it, those kind of things. So that would be one example that could possibly be there. And then, like Ian Quote does, creating personal projects. I mean, if you've got personal projects that you're creating and you think that it can benefit more than just you, I think that would be a place to start. I mean, obviously, I'm a big proponent of creating things and getting money for them. So I think you should create things and sell them and make a profit on them and make money off of them. But at the same time, we have such an awesome community that I think if we came together and sort of had a drive to create things for everybody to use at the same time, I think we could really benefit. And so figure out what sphere of influence you have, what you work on, and then meet the people that are in that sphere, figure out what they need, and work to create those kind of things. You know, we work a lot with web designers and web developers, and so recently these guys just launched sort of a new framework for how to build your CSS and HTML and those kind of things within a Rails framework, which is what we primarily work in. So it's very specific. You know, a lot of you guys probably will never even touch it or see it, but it will benefit people in sort of our little sphere of influence. And so there's nothing wrong with having a tiny corner of the world that you can influence and making sure that you're doing everything you can for that. I think that's awesome.
It's a question about the design process.
Yeah.
And so it's the idea of a pause or a rest or setting something aside and then you do in your subconscious. I mean, tell me a little bit about, do you put that in your process specifically or is that not something you do?
Yeah, usually it's my wife telling me I have to stop and play with the kid. No, that's a good question. So in the design process, yes, I think you have to give yourself time away from design or whatever it is that you're doing. And that can, you know, figure out what that looks like for you, whether it's if you've got kids, you know, go play with your kids, you know, spend time with your spouse. Cats, I don't even know cats. Sorry, cat lovers. Yeah, but I mean, you can't go all the time. And I think if you try to go all the time, that stifles creativity. You know, I think you have to allow yourself to sort of get a reboost and reboot, as it were. So I think, yeah, in a design process, you know, let's say something's not due until next Friday, or you've got a timeline that you're working on. Schedule in time just to forget about stuff, you know, because there are going to be times where you want to just crank stuff out and, you know, you're in the zone and you want to get things done. But I think it's scheduling time to rest and to get away from the screen and to go do things that have nothing to do with what you're doing. I find at least that a lot of times ideas come in those situations and I come back and I'm like, oh, okay, that's what I should do. So.
Yeah, so that was my question. So do you think that when you're tapping into your subconscious that it's been cranking the whole time?
Right.
That's my question.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, I think that comes down to the more that you allow yourself to sort of think in the ways that we kind of talked about, I think the more you'll find that you're always sort of going to be thinking in that mode. And so figuring out what that looks like for you and making sure that you can write stuff down as you think about it or execute on whatever it is you execute on with that.
How do you actually find time to do that in business? When we started our business, there was plenty of time to think and play, but you know, we've gotten busier and you know, there's more deadlines and there's less time and there's efficiency and budgets, and we've gotten away from that a little bit, and it kills me. But I don't know how to bring the balance back. Have you faced that challenge before, and how have you overcome it?
Yeah. I think in a lot of ways, and this is something that I've given a lot of thought to, is we are professionals, right? As designers or developers or creatives, we're professionals in what we do. Similar to name another profession, name another industry. And I think at times we don't think of ourselves like that. I think we think of ourselves as, you know, whatever, creative thinkers or artists or just blue-collar workers getting things done for a particular client. And the reason I bring up professionalism is that I think a professional comes to a situation, comes to a client, comes to a business, and is very proactive with how things are going to go. And this isn't something that you can change overnight. Usually it involves, you know, a lot of steps, but as creatives, I feel like we should be more often than not telling the client, not telling the client what to do, but telling the client how things are going to be working within our our system because we're the profession. And we don't discount what they have to say, but at the same time, we are the experts in the field. I think there's nothing wrong with seeing ourselves that way. I think we actually do ourselves a disservice when we sort of don't think of ourselves that way. We let the client dictate schedules, and we let the client dictate all of these things. And there's something to be said for working with the client. There's a lot of bridges that I'm not building that are there. You can't see them. But at the same time, as professionals, it's up to us to sort of define what that process looks like. It's up to us to define how we work. It's up to us to define how we bill, how we're paid, all of those kind of things. And if we don't have those in place, I think we're going to run into problems. So I think the more we can get those into place, the better off we're going to be, whether it comes to scheduling or billing or whatever it is. So I think the more we can do as designers, as the creative community, become more professional, I think the better we're going to be in terms of solving these